Many people misunderstand the meaning of high concept, presuming that it means an idea that is sophisticated or conceptually deep. In fact, high concept means something that's more the opposite, a work with a premise that can be succinctly explained. And in keeping with that, Pacific Rim is about as high concept as they come. A giant monster fights giant robots. But there is far more to Pacific Rim than that description implies, and likewise, its journey to the screen is not so straightforward either. Our story begins with Guillermo del Toro, an accomplished filmmaker with both an eye for the artist's style of great movie making, yet down-to-earth enough to jokingly describe himself as Michael Moore's stunt double. Del Toro had a dream project, a film he really wanted to make, and with some big successes like Hellboy and Pan's Labyrinth behind him, he felt he had it. That film wasn't this one. It was actually a film adaptation of one of H.P. Lovecraft's most famous stories, At the Mountains of Madness. When Del Toro approached Universal to make the movie, it had a number of positives for Hollywood execs to love. Tom Cruise, a historic lead actor with high public name recognition, and James Cameron as the producer, who had just created a few years previously Avatar to much acclaim. And this was an adaptation, very popular in Hollywood, but didn't require paying out royalties or having any problems with the author or their estate. But there was one big strike against that film. They were aiming for an R rating. And if that doesn't have any romance in it, studios get nervous about that. Del Toro felt that the rating was essential, though, because they were aiming for a film not full of blood, gore, or profanity, but felt that this adaptation of Lovecraft demanded a film that was intense, too intense for a PG-13 film. That might sound odd, but Del Toro had just come off another film that he co-wrote and produced called Don't Be Afraid of the Dark. And despite the fact the film had no violence, profanity, or sex, it received an R rating because it was such an intense and scary film. His adaptation of Lovecraft demanded no less, he felt, and feared that not being upfront about it risked the screenplay being hamstrung. It needed to be frightening, and it was, because the studio was clearly terrified of it. A lot of work was put into pre-production, but Universal was cool on the project. The day finally arrived when they told Del Toro that the stalled production was finally canceled. Crushed by depression, Del Toro came to another meeting full of conflicting emotions. He had previously had frustrations working on the films for The Hobbit, which he committed 2 years of his life to, only for the financial problems of MGM to leave that movie in limbo. It was when he was coming off The Hobbit that he was approached by Legendary in the hopes that he would be interested in doing something with them. He was open to producing something with them, certainly. Del Toro was a prolific producer, and when they explained what it was, he was definitely in. It was based on a treatment by Travis Beacham, whom Del Toro had briefly worked with when Beacham's first spec script, A Killing on Carnival Row, was picked up by New Line. The film also wound up in development hell, although it has since been picked up for a series by Amazon. But after that, Beacham had success with his script for the remake of Clash of the Titans. With Titans a hit, Beacham was in a position to float to his agent this idea that he'd had 3 years earlier, a literal vision. While walking along the beach on a particularly foggy day, he looked out at the carnival, and as he did so, an image came into his mind of a giant monster emerging and a giant robot emerging to fight it. He put those ideas aside and played with them until he came up with the concept of requiring 2 pilots to control robots, this left and right brain idea that he felt offered more to the film's story than the high concept suggested. He wanted to have more human aspects to this conflict. He approached Legend about it, who in turn approached Del Toro straight off of The Hobbit, as I mentioned. Del Toro was intrigued. He'd grown up on kaiju and other Japanese cultural imports. He recounted a tale of when he was 8 years old, taking the bus across town to see a kaiju film at a brick theater. Now, it wasn't called a brick theater because the theater was made out of bricks. It was because the theater gave the patrons bricks so they could smash any rats that bothered them while they were watching the film. As if that wasn't bad enough, someone in the balcony threw a cup full of urine over the railing and it landed on Del Toro's head, splashing fresh pee all over him. Despite all of this, though, the movie War of the Gargantuas so entertained him that he stayed for the rest of the film. So he was excited at the prospect of a kaiju film, but At the Mountains of Madness was the next film that he wanted to direct, so that's why he opted only to produce. So, when Madness had the plug pulled, that was when Legendary invited him to that meeting. "You've contributed a lot to the story and art development of Pacific Rim," they said. "Can we convince you to direct it?" So Del Toro laid it out there. In a way, he was excited at the prospect. But he had committed years of his life to making movies that were never getting made. He felt that his career had become a long string of him trying to make movies and studios getting cold feet about them, with him having to either abandon them or drag them across the finish line himself to see them finally done. The artist was wearing out because they just weren't backing him up anymore. He asked Thomas Tull, Legendary's CEO, directly about this problem. Quote, "I need to really experience what it is to have somebody pushing a movie rather than me pulling the movie. Will you really push with me?" Tull got it, and assured him that Pacific Rim was going to be different, that they were going to make this movie happen. Once he had the assurance that he wasn't going to be throwing away further years of his life on dead-end pictures, Del Toro was all in. Work quickly began at Bleak House, a home that is about 10% production facility, 40% inspiration and reference material, and 50% a monument to insanity. From a life-size model of Boris Karloff transforming into Frankenstein's monster to a false window intended to create the impression of a storm outside, the place is filled with all manner of things, props from Del Toro's movies and reflections upon his interests. His idols were all around him, a standing model of H.P. Lovecraft before a library shelf leafing through one of his own books, and in the sitting area, a statue of Edgar Allan Poe occupies one of the chairs, as if ready to offer some critiques on the latest script. Bleak House is too much for his poor family to take, who live a short ways away, but it's here where the artist comes to find inspiration. With Pacific Rim, he set to work revisiting the script Beecham wrote, and brought in a team of designers to develop the look of the film. Francisco Ruiz Velasco, who frequently worked with him, was one of the larger forces on the project, along with veteran science fiction artist Wayne Barlow, as in Barlow's Guide to Extraterrestrials, Ty Rubin Ellison, who in his early Hollywood years had done visual design for the Star Wars Special Edition before regularly working with Del Toro on several of his films, including designing Hellboy's revolver, the Samaritan. They were joined by a host of talented vets and up-and-comers. The designers all worked in Bleak House under Del Toro's direct supervision, although his initial principle is to always let them go nuts, see where it takes them, before he started imposing his vision upon them. Kaiju may be a classic genre, but try not to draw directly from that, was his philosophy. Don't look for Godzilla monsters for inspiration, look elsewhere. He specifically was inspired by the painting The Colossus. Also, he insisted, remember that the kaiju are living weapons. Be sure to infuse the design with that. Anything you put on it needs to be something that it can use to fight. The mythology was that these creatures was an invading force from another realm entering through the interstice, later called the breach, created to exterminate us, and each one was made to be tougher than the last. Beecham's backstory created the idea that these creatures were not only being sent into our realm, but being pitted against each other in fights to decide which form is the toughest and strongest, so each iteration was an improvement over the one before it. Hence the need for the robots to fight them. But while the kaiju were always to look fresh for battle, taking the best of all of the victors and using that to make a new creation, the robots could not be so easily replaced by mankind, and thus would show the scars of previous battles. Humanity is, after all, losing this war, we find. These jaegers were our last line of defense, and so should never look like toys, and they shouldn't just look like scaled-up human beings either. Each had to have their own design and a style representative of the country that they came from, because this needed to be a global response, it was felt, not a national one. so the nations would create their jaegers with their own cultural conceits and technical emphasis. The American Gypsy Danger is characteristic of an American football player, while the Australian striker Eureka is built more like a Mad Max brawler, complete with pseudo-brass knuckles, and the Russian Cherno Alpha is built like a nuclear reactor was fused with a walking tank. While the design team and storyboard artist Robert McCallum worked in the corral, as Del Toro put it, his term for giving creative people a freedom within prescribed limits to ensure that they stick to what was needed while still having artistic freedom. He was also working on trying to bring as much of his crew over from At the Mountain of Madness as possible, thanks in part to producer Callum Green, who worked to get everyone through the unpleasant transition between these projects. One good thing that came out of that, though, was that while the sound stages large enough to accommodate Pacific Rim were all booked out for years to come, the tanking of madness meant that all the sound stages that had been reserved in its name could now transfer those reservations over to Pacific Rim to ensure that they would meet their deadline. One of the big things, no pun intended, they would need for those sound stages were the insides of the jaegers. Specifically, Del Toro wanted the interiors to be practical effects, and it's easy to see why. Beecham had ensured that the union between the two pilots was part of where the personal drama comes from, and so Del Toro wanted to have the actors performing in a physical environment together, reacting together, with the same required utility as a real robot would have required of them, as opposed to being in a green room wearing a motion control suit, divorced from all that activity. Legacy Effects, a company formed by the protégés of the great Stan Winston, were brought in to build this working interior, called Con-Pods, complete with the ability to simulate the combat conditions the occupants would experience during these fights. Computer effects would be provided by ILM for the many robot and monster scenes, but for the interiors, Del Toro felt that going old school was really what was needed. But it was complicated. Shane Mahan of Legacy had to have his team dress the actors into the equipment and then have his team try to sync with the actors so that it would appear that those two were controlling everything rather than the team of technicians. But even with this, the demands were great and the sessions grueling for the actors, as the sets were the world's most expensive fitness set. The first use of them was for the Australian team, where the worst problems had to be shaken out of it. So when Rob Kaczynski came back for the sole fight that he was going to do alongside of Idris Elba, he was doing just dandy, while Elba was being so physically overwhelmed he might have started hallucinating. Two versions of the Con-Pods were created. One was called the Shake and Bake, to allow for the actors to perform, and the other was the Mighty Mo, which was solely for the stunt performers, and be used for those serious kaiju attacks. It was no easy feat either. The Con-Pods weighed in at around 40,000 pounds, about the weight of your average filled city bus, and it had to be able to shift and move on cue and precisely the way the scene was demanded. When Del Toro was satisfied with the creature and robot designs coming out of Bleak House, he would stamp them for approval, and they were sent to ILM, with specific guidelines to follow. Shooting had to be very careful to ensure that the audience never got the sense that these things were not gargantuan. That was key. Just the right lighting was needed, just the right angles were called for, or the awesomeness, in the most traditional meaning of that word, would be lost. John Knoll and Hal Hickel, both of whom won Oscars for their works on Pirates of the Caribbean, worked at ILM to bring those sculpts to life and pit them in the complex fights that were demanded. The expense of all this put a severe strain on the production and forced Del Toro to work out a very tight schedule to hit all of their deadlines. Fortunately, his time in development for both The Hobbit and Madness had forced him to repeatedly cope with these complexities on paper, so that even though this was the first time shooting something as large and complex as Pacific Rim, it was something he effectively had 2 dry runs at before, so that he could approach this with a certain degree of confidence. It paid off. While the shoot demanded long hours and 7 days a week shooting, he was so prepared that there was never any doubts plaguing him during the shoots or when frustrations popped up. Something always goes wrong in any film set, after all, and in this case, it was his first film where he was going to be using a digital camera and shooting for possible 3D release. and the humidity wound up destroying one of those special cameras. But nevertheless, the film moved ahead, the cast and crew buoyed up by his example, friendly but professional, not taking his own problems out on those nearby, as can happen when a director is in over their heads, running into problems, or just crushed by stress. Ron Perlman, a longtime collaborator who came on board to play the head of the black market, said that despite the enormous pressures, he'd actually never seen his friends seem more happy and relaxed than during this shoot. After years of having his pictures undermined by studio cowardice and disorder, getting to be back filming again seemed to rejuvenate rather than to wear him down. The end result was that writer Travis Beacham, who first conceived of it coming out of the Santa Monica fog, found the movie everything he dreamed it would be and more, a rare thing for any writer. And for Del Toro himself, it was a reminder of why he wanted to make movies in the first place. So let's take a look at the results of all this hard work, Pacific Rim.